April 17, 1945. Western Germany. The Ruhr Pocket. The air smelled of ash and antiseptic. In the skeletal remains of what had once been a German field hospital, a young woman knelt beside a dying Wehrmacht soldier, her hands trembling as she pressed gauze against a wound that would not stop bleeding. Her name was Margarethe Hoffmann, 23 years old, a nurse trained in the Reich's ideal of duty and sacrifice. Her white apron, once crisp and starched, was now a patchwork of rust-colored stains. The building around her shuddered with each distant artillery strike, plaster dust drifting down like snow in the dim afternoon light. She had not slept in 3 days. The hospital had no morphine left, no plasma, no clean water. The soldier beneath her hands was mumbling something, a woman's name, perhaps his mother's, and Margarethe found herself whispering back words she did not believe, telling him he would be all right, that help was coming. But she knew the truth. Help was not coming. Not from her side. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder. American engines. The distinctive rumble of Sherman tanks and supply trucks, advancing through the ruined streets of Duisburg with methodical certainty. Margarethe's heart hammered against her ribs. She had been told stories since 1942, stories of what happened to German medical personnel when the Allies arrived. Stories of retribution, of prisoners dragged away and never seen again. Her hands, still pressed against the soldier's chest, began to shake uncontrollably. The door burst open. Sunlight flooded the darkened hall, silhouetting 3 figures in American uniforms. One of them carried a medical bag marked with a red cross. Margarethe looked up, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat, and waited for whatever came next. The spring of 1945 was a season of collapse. The Third Reich, which had once stretched from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow, was disintegrating like wet paper in the hands of converging Allied armies. In the West, American, British, and Canadian forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into the German heartland. In the East, Soviet armies were grinding toward Berlin with apocalyptic fury. Between these twin juggernauts, Germany was being crushed into rubble and ruin. But within this collapse existed countless small dramas, moments of human encounter that would be forgotten by history's broad brushstrokes yet would echo through individual lives forever. One such drama unfolded in the makeshift hospitals, aid stations, and casualty collection points scattered across Western Germany, where German medical personnel, predominantly women, came face to face with the American forces they had been taught to fear and hate. These women were not soldiers in the traditional sense, yet they wore uniforms, served the Wehrmacht, and had spent years embedded within the machinery of Nazi Germany's war effort. They were nurses, orderlies, and medical auxiliaries, trained at institutions like the Reichsschule für NS-Schwestern, where clinical skill was mixed with ideological indoctrination. They had learned to heal the body while serving the state. They had been told that their work was sacred, that they were the gentle hands of the Volk, caring for the warriors who would secure Germany's destiny. They had also been told what to expect from the enemy. Reich propaganda had spent 4 years painting the Americans as barbarous, racially degenerate liberators who would show no mercy to defeated Germans. The Ministry of Propaganda's films showed caricatures of American soldiers as gangsters and cowboys, lawless and cruel, driven by material greed and lacking any sense of honor. German medical personnel, especially women, were warned that capture would mean humiliation at best, violence at worst. Some had been issued cyanide capsules. Others were simply told to flee westward ahead of the advancing front, to disappear into the chaos of refugees clogging every road. But by April 1945, flight was no longer possible for many. The speed of the Allied advance had trapped entire hospitals behind the lines. Medical staff found themselves in an impossible position: abandon their patients and risk court-martial or worse, or stay and face the unknown wrath of the approaching Americans. Most chose to stay. They bandaged wounds with torn bedsheets, diluted morphine with saline to stretch the last vials, and waited in cellars and damaged wards for the rumble of foreign engines to arrive. What they expected was vengeance. What they received was something far more disorienting. When the first American medical units entered captured German hospitals in March and April 1945, they did not come with weapons drawn. They came with penicillin. They came with plasma and bandages and surgical kits still packed in factory wax paper. They came with a philosophy that had been drilled into every medic and corpsman from the moment they entered training. Treat the wounded first, ask questions later. The United States military medical system in 1945 was the most sophisticated and well-supplied in human history. Behind every frontline combat medic stood an entire infrastructure of evacuation hospitals, surgical teams, supply depots, and transport networks designed to move wounded men from the battlefield to an operating table in less than an hour. American medics carried more medical supplies in their packs than entire German hospitals had access to by war's end. A single American field hospital unit possessed more penicillin than the entire Wehrmacht Medical Corps had seen in a year. But beyond logistics and resources, American medics carried something else, an ethos. It was codified in the Geneva Convention, yes, but it ran deeper than legal obligation. It was rooted in a particular American conception of medicine as fundamentally apolitical, a practice that transcended nation and ideology. The oath to do no harm, the commitment to treat all wounded regardless of uniform. These were not abstract principles to the men of the Medical Corps. They were operational doctrine. Captain James Henderson, a surgeon with the 5th Armored Division, would later write in his diary about entering a German aid station near Kassel on April 2, 1945. The place was a butcher shop, he recorded. Maybe 30 wounded, mostly gut shots and amputations, lying on straw. 2 German nurses, both young, both terrified. One tried to stand at attention when we came in. She was swaying on her feet. My first thought wasn't that she was the enemy. My first thought was that she needed sleep, food, and about 6 more nurses. Henderson's unit spent the next 18 hours working alongside those German nurses, stabilizing patients for evacuation. The Americans provided the supplies. The German nurses, who knew the patient's medical histories, provided context and assisted in treatments they had not been able to perform themselves for lack of materials. When it was done, Henderson had his men distribute K-rations and cigarettes to the German staff before moving on. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times across Western Germany in the spring of 1945. American medics entered German medical facilities expecting to take control of enemy assets. Instead, they found exhausted colleagues working under impossible conditions, and their instinct was not to conquer but to collaborate. For the German nurses, this response was incomprehensible. Sister Erika Steinmann, who had served at a Wehrmacht field hospital in the Rhineland since 1943, recorded her first encounter with American medics in a letter written weeks after the war's end. "I thought they would shoot us," she wrote. "Or worse. I had heard the stories. But when they came through the door, the first thing the Americans said, through a translator, was, 'Where are your critical patients?' Not 'surrender your weapons' or 'you are under arrest.' Just, 'Where are your critical patients?' I could not speak. I could only point." Steinmann described how the American medics moved through the ward with practiced efficiency, triaging wounded German soldiers while speaking to each man in calm tones, even though most could not understand English. "They touched them gently," she wrote. "Even the SS men. Even those who had swastikas tattooed on their arms. The Americans touched them gently and worked to save them. I stood there holding a basin of dirty water, and I could not reconcile what I was seeing with anything I had been told. The cognitive dissonance was profound." These women had spent years within a system that defined human worth by race and ideology, where medical care was rationed according to perceived value to the Reich. The concept of treating enemy wounded with the same urgency as one's own soldiers was not just foreign, it was ideologically subversive. It undermined the entire framework through which they had been taught to understand the war. Some German nurses interpreted American behavior as naivety, a softness that would inevitably lead to defeat. Others saw it as a strategic trick, a temporary kindness that would be revoked once the war ended. But as days turned to weeks and the American presence solidified, a different realization began to take hold. This was not performance or strategy. This was simply how they operated. The Americans brought not just medicine but an entire system of care that was, by German standards of 1945, almost fantastical in its abundance. They had portable X-ray machines. They had entire surgical theaters mounted in trucks. They had specialized teams for different types of wounds, orthopedic surgeons, neurosurgeons, thoracic specialists, all working within miles of the front line. They had blood plasma in such quantity that it was used routinely, not just in desperate cases. They had penicillin, which German medical staff had heard of but rarely seen, and they used it on German prisoners with the same frequency as on American casualties. Margarethe Hoffmann, the nurse who had knelt beside a dying soldier as the Americans arrived, would later describe the moment that shattered her understanding of the war. An American medic, she never learned his name, approached her after they had stabilized her critical patients. He was young, perhaps 20, with a round face and glasses that made him look like a schoolboy. Through a translator, he asked her when she had last eaten. She told him 3 days prior, a half ration of bread and ersatz coffee. He nodded, left, and returned 15 minutes later with a cardboard box. Inside were K-rations, canned meat, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, and instant coffee. More food than she had seen in a month. "Eat," the translator said. "You can't take care of patients if you're starving." The American medic smiled at her. Smiled, as if they were colleagues on a normal shift in a normal hospital, as if her uniform did not mark her as the enemy, as if the world was not ending outside. Margarethe took the box with shaking hands. Later that night, sitting in the ruins of the hospital's administrative office, she opened the chocolate bar and ate it slowly, letting each piece melt on her tongue. It was Swiss chocolate, seized from German supply depots and now being given back to her by her conquerors. The irony was not lost on her. But what struck her more deeply was the medic's smile. It had been genuine. Not mocking, not pitying, just human. That chocolate bar became her personal symbol of everything she had not understood about the enemy. It represented abundance. Yes, the Americans had so much that they could afford to be generous even to their defeated foes. But it also represented something more unsettling, a fundamental difference in how they saw the world. They did not treat her kindly because they had conquered her. They treated her kindly because, in their eyes, she was a medical professional caught in a war, and medical professionals had obligations to each other that superseded national boundaries. The historical record documents this pattern extensively. Reports from American medical units advancing through Germany in April and May 1945 consistently note efforts to integrate captured German medical personnel into Allied casualty care operations. The 102nd Evacuation Hospital, operating near Magdeburg, reported employing 17 German nurses and 4 German doctors to assist with the overwhelming number of casualties from both sides. The commanding officer's report noted that the German staff worked with dedication and showed professional competence, and recommended they be provided with additional rations and billeting separate from standard POW facilities. This was not universal policy. Different units handled German medical personnel in different ways, but the general pattern across American sectors was one of pragmatic cooperation rather than punitive segregation. The rationale was partly practical. American medical units were overwhelmed with casualties, and trained nurses were desperately needed regardless of nationality. But the execution revealed deeper attitudes. German military nurses had expected to be treated as prisoners of war, subject to interrogation, confinement, and coerced labor. Instead, many found themselves effectively employed as colleagues. They were asked, not ordered, to continue caring for German wounded. They were provided with food and supplies. They were included in staff meetings where treatment protocols were discussed. Some were even given access to American medical literature and trained in techniques, like penicillin administration and plasma transfusion, that they had never learned under the Reich system. Anna Weber, a surgical nurse from Munich who had served at a Wehrmacht hospital in Würzburg, described being invited to observe an American surgical team performing a procedure she had never seen. the repair of a torn subclavian artery using vascular clamps and fine sutures that the German system had lacked. The surgeon, a captain from Pennsylvania, explained each step to me in German, she later recounted. He knew I was Wehrmacht. He knew I had cared for soldiers who had killed Americans. It did not matter to him. What mattered was teaching the procedure so that more men, any men, could be saved. This sharing of knowledge was perhaps more subversive than any propaganda leaflet. It demonstrated, in concrete terms, that the American system operated on different principles. German medical training under the Reich had been functional but limited, focused on field expedients and triage under scarcity. American medicine, by contrast, was expansive and innovative, constantly pushing at the boundaries of what was possible. The difference was not just in resources but in philosophy. One system triaged by worth, the other treated everyone as worth saving. Yet the experience was not without complexity or pain. For many German nurses, the kindness they received from American medics was inseparable from a growing horror at what their own side had done. As Germany collapsed, the truth about the concentration camps became unavoidable. American forces liberating Buchenwald, Dachau, and dozens of smaller camps brought in German civilians, including medical personnel, to witness what had been perpetrated in their nation's name. Some nurses were assigned to care for liberated prisoners, skeletal figures suffering from typhus, dysentery, and starvation so severe that feeding them required careful medical management to avoid refeeding syndrome. The juxtaposition was cruel. German nurses who had just been treated with decency by their captors now had to confront the fact that their own government had operated an industrial system of murder. Some refused to believe it, insisting the camps were Allied propaganda. Others collapsed under the weight of the revelation. Still others, perhaps most, occupied an ambiguous space of partial knowledge and willful ignorance, grappling with how much they had known, should have known, or chosen not to know. Sister Ursula Mannheim, who had worked at a military hospital in Bavaria, was part of a group taken to Dachau in early May 1945. She wrote later, in a memoir published in the 1970s, about the experience of walking through the camp under American guard, seeing the crematoria, the barracks, the piles of corpses not yet buried. An American nurse walked beside me, Mannheim wrote. She did not speak. I do not know if she could have found words even if we shared a language. When we returned to the hospital, she brought me tea. English tea with milk, prepared carefully in a real cup. She set it in front of me and said, through the translator, "You still have to work. Drink this." I could not reconcile her kindness with what I had just seen. I could not reconcile anything. That tea, ordinary, domestic, a small gesture of care, became Mannheim's symbol, her haunted counterpoint to the horrors of the camp. It represented the Americans' insistence on maintaining humanity even when confronting the inhuman. They did not withhold care or compassion from German medical personnel because of Dachau. They continued to treat them as colleagues, even as they forced them to confront what the Reich had done. The message was implicit but clear. You are responsible, but you are also human. Those two facts must coexist. The transformation in perspective among German nurses was neither immediate nor universal, but it was documented. In the months following Germany's surrender, as the occupation solidified and the initial chaos of war's end gave way to reconstruction, many German medical personnel found themselves working in Allied-run hospitals, DP camps, and rehabilitation centers. They were no longer Wehrmacht nurses. They were simply nurses, working alongside Americans, British, and eventually even Soviet medical staff in some areas. The experience altered how they understood not just the war, but the principles on which societies could be organized. The American medical system's abundance, its wastefulness, even, from a German perspective, revealed an underlying economic and philosophical difference. The Americans could afford to treat everyone because their system was not built on scarcity and zero-sum competition. They had more because they produced more, and they produced more because their system incentivized innovation and cooperation rather than domination and extraction. This was not a lesson explicitly taught. It was absorbed through experience, the American medic who gave away his cigarettes because he had a carton more waiting at base camp, the surgical team that used a $50 instrument once and discarded it rather than sterilizing and reusing it endlessly, the ambulance drivers who would travel miles out of their way to evacuate a single wounded German POW, burning fuel that German forces would never have spared. Greta Schneider, a theater nurse from Hamburg, tried to articulate this realization in a letter to her sister in June 1945. "They do not think like us," she wrote. "Everything we were taught about efficiency, about discipline, about sacrifice, they violate all of it, and yet their system works better than ours ever did. They are loud and informal. Their officers eat with enlisted men. They waste resources on prisoners who may never fight again. They play music in the surgical wards, American jazz, which we were told was degenerate, and yet their morale is higher than ours was even in the victories of 1940. I do not understand it, but I cannot deny what I have seen." Schneider's confusion was the confusion of someone raised in an authoritarian system encountering a democratic one for the first time. The American military, for all its hierarchy, operated on principles of consent and voluntary cooperation that were alien to Wehrmacht culture. American medics were not afraid of their officers. They joked with them, disagreed with them, and were encouraged to use initiative and make independent decisions. This decentralization of authority, which would have been seen as chaos in the German system, somehow produced better medical outcomes. The symbolic object that recurred most frequently in German nurses' accounts was not weapons or flags, but food. American rations, in their abundance and variety, represented everything about the American system that Germans had been taught to despise but could not help but envy. The K-ration with its chocolate bar and cigarettes. The hot meals served from field kitchens that could feed hundreds. The coffee, real coffee, brewed strong and served generously. The casual way Americans shared food, offering cigarettes to prisoners, distributing surplus rations to German children. Lieselotte Bauer, a Red Cross nurse from Leipzig, described the moment that changed her understanding of the war's meaning. It was May 10, 1945, 2 days after the unconditional surrender. She was working at an American field hospital near Dresden, caring for wounded German soldiers who were now, technically, prisoners. An American supply sergeant came through the ward distributing dinner, canned stew, white bread, tinned peaches. He gave the German patients the same portions as the American casualties in the adjacent ward. I stopped him and asked, through a translator, why he was feeding the prisoners so much, Bauer recalled. We had been told to expect starvation rations, punishment for our defeat. The sergeant looked confused by the question. He said, "They're patients, aren't they? Patients need to eat." As if it was the simplest thing in the world. As if there was no other way to think about it. That stew, bland and oversalted by American standards, but a feast compared to German rations in late 1945, crystallized for Bauer the fundamental difference between the systems. The Americans did not starve their prisoners because they did not need to. They had enough. And because they had enough, they could afford to be decent. It was not nobility, necessarily, it was the product of abundance. But abundance itself, Bauer realized, was not random. It was the result of a system that valued production and innovation over conquest and exploitation. The historical evidence of American treatment of German medical personnel in 1945 is extensive but scattered. Official reports from the medical corps emphasize practical cooperation and medical outcomes. Personal accounts from American medics often mention German nurses in passing, as colleagues or assistants rather than defeated enemies. German sources, memoirs, letters, post-war interviews reveal the deeper emotional and ideological impact. One particularly detailed account comes from Dr. Heinrich Moltke, a Wehrmacht surgeon who worked alongside American medical teams from April through August 1945. His diary, published posthumously, describes the gradual shift in his own thinking. Initially, he viewed American kindness as weakness and their abundance as the product of having avoided the devastation of bombing and ground combat on their own soil. But as weeks passed, he began to see the systemic differences. They are not kind because they are naive, Moltke wrote in June. They are kind because their system allows for kindness. In our system, kindness was a luxury, something to be indulged only when it did not interfere with efficiency and duty. In their system, kindness is operational doctrine. It makes them stronger, not weaker. I thought men motivated by ideology would always outfight men motivated by comfort and material gain. I was wrong. Men who believe they are fighting for a system that values their individual lives will fight harder and more effectively than men who believe they are expendable in service of an abstract ideal. This realization, that the Americans' individualism and material focus were sources of strength rather than weakness, was perhaps the most profound ideological shift German medical personnel experienced. They had been taught that self-sacrifice and subordination to the collective were the highest virtues. The American system, which emphasized individual rights and personal welfare, should have been inferior. But it had won. Decisively. The nurses and doctors who worked alongside American medics in 1945 could not ignore the evidence before their eyes. The Americans were better fed, better equipped, and better trained. Their wounded had higher survival rates. Their medical personnel were less traumatized, less exhausted. The system worked, and it worked precisely because it did not demand endless sacrifice. By the time the occupation zones solidified in the summer of 1945, thousands of German medical personnel had been processed through American hands. Most were screened for Nazi Party affiliation and war crimes involvement, but those whose only crime was serving as military nurses or doctors were generally released or employed in civilian medical capacities under Allied supervision. The experience left a lasting mark. Many of these women would become part of West Germany's post-war medical establishment. They would work in the rebuilt hospitals of the Federal Republic, train new generations of nurses, and occasionally speak or write about their experiences at war's end. Almost uniformly, they described the encounter with American medical personnel as a turning point, the moment when their understanding of the war and its meaning began to crack. Some embraced this transformation fully, becoming advocates for democratic principles and international medical cooperation. Others remained conflicted, acknowledging the kindness they had received while never fully reconciling it with loyalty to the memory of their fallen comrades. A few rejected the experience entirely, insisting in post-war interviews that American treatment had been a calculated psychological operation rather than genuine compassion. But even among those who resisted the lesson, the seed had been planted. They had seen that the enemy was not monstrous. They had received care from those they had been taught to hate. They had witnessed a system that operated on principles antithetical to everything the Reich had represented, and that system had proven more effective, more humane, and more sustainable. The epilogue of this story extends beyond 1945, into the decades of the Cold War and the reconstruction of Europe. The nurses who had worked alongside American medics in Germany's final days became links in a chain of cultural transmission. They carried knowledge, both technical and philosophical, into the post-war German medical system. They had learned not just how to administer penicillin, but why a society might choose to make such medicine abundant rather than scarce. They had seen not just American efficiency, but American generosity, and they had experienced firsthand the power of a system built on the premise that human life had inherent value regardless of nationality or ideology. In the small towns and cities of West Germany, in the hospitals and clinics that rose from the rubble, these women practiced medicine informed by what they had witnessed. When they trained new nurses, they passed on techniques learned from American medics. When they interacted with patients, some carried forward the memory of how they themselves had been treated, not as enemies deserving punishment, but as colleagues deserving respect. The Marshall Plan would rebuild Germany's infrastructure, but it was encounters like these, small, personal, mediated through acts of care and unexpected kindness, that began the longer process of ideological reconstruction. The German nurses who were stunned by American decency in 1945 became ambassadors, however unwitting, of the possibility that former enemies could become partners, that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, that systems built on individual dignity could be stronger than those built on collective sacrifice. In the end, the story of German nurses encountering American medics in 1945 is a story about what happens when ideology meets reality. The Reich had promised that will and sacrifice would triumph over material weakness and moral decadence. The Americans, simply by being themselves, abundant, informal, pragmatic, generous, disproved that promise more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have. The symbolic power of a chocolate bar given freely, a cup of tea offered after witnessing horror, a meal shared between former enemies. These small acts of humanity accumulated into a lesson about what kind of society could sustain itself in the long run. Not a society built on racial hierarchy and perpetual struggle, but one built on the mundane principles of enough food, decent care, and the radical idea that people, even enemy people, deserve to be treated with basic dignity. The nurses who lived through this transformation carried it forward. Some spoke of it openly. Others kept it private, a personal recalibration of conscience that shaped their choices in quieter ways. But collectively, they represented a bridge between the world that had ended in 1945 and the world that would be built afterward, a world where the memory of being treated unexpectedly well by an enemy might plant the seed for a different kind of future. In the ruins of Germany, amid the ash and the dying, that seed was planted. It would take decades to grow, and its growth would never be complete or uncontested. But it grew nonetheless, nourished by the simple, subversive act of American medics treating their defeated enemies not as objects of vengeance, but as human beings worthy of care. In that act, repeated thousands of times across the collapsing Reich, lay a truth about power and civilization that no amount of propaganda could erase. That true strength lies not in the ability to dominate and destroy, but in the capacity to show mercy and build something better from the ruins. The chocolate bar, the cup of tea, the shared meal, these became symbols not just of American abundance, but of a different way of organizing human society. And for the German nurses who received them, stunned and disbelieving in the spring of 1945, these small kindnesses opened a door to understanding that the world they had believed in was not the only world possible. In that realization, painful and disorienting as it was, lay the first fragile possibility of peace.